We're starting the conversation, but we want to hear from you. Send your thoughts, questions, or anything else you want to hear us discuss to feedback@theethicalpanda.com. Or you can find us on Twitter, Instagram, or TikTok under The Ethical Panda. You can even chat with us on Discord or Facebook. Find those links in the show notes or on our website, theethicalpanda.com. And if you like this content, why not become a member? You get early access to ad-free episodes for all podcasts in the Ethical Panda family, along with bonus content at the end of most episodes, plus member-only episodes. And it's just $5 a month, or $55 for a full year. Sign up at theethicalpanda.com or through the link in the show notes. And now, back to our episode. Is tolerance extinction? Was Magneto right? Have the writers once again decided to solve an interesting question of ethics by just having the villain go nuts? We're going to discuss all of that with myself and Riki Hayashi as we talk about X-Men 97, the new show from Disney, the animated callback to the older X-Men show that is raising all kinds of awesome ethical questions as an X-Men show should do. Now, for a bit of context, some people might be wondering, why in the world are you discussing the ethics of the show in episode before it ends? And there's a couple of reasons. One is because I am actually, as you'll hear us talk about, I have a lot of thoughts both about the questions that are being raised and the kind of meta ways that the writers are trying to push one particular answer that I'm not really thrilled about. So I actually think kind of now, when we don't know what's actually going to happen at the end, when the characters are wrestling with this question, as we saw at the end of the most recent episode, is a great time to talk about it. And by the way, for those who haven't seen the show, don't worry, we'll kind of give you some basic summary. It's a lot of the same kind of questions you've heard from the X-Men before, but in different ways. So we're going to definitely revisit this again after the last episode comes out. For schedule reasons also, this was one of the best times because I'm about to go on a 3-week road trip during which I will be recording, but it's going to be a lot harder. So Riki, welcome, say hello, and tell me a little bit about your background with the X-Men before this show.
Well, hello, Matthew. Good to be back. My experience with X-Men, I remember watching the original cartoon in the 90s. It was right there, alongside Batman the Animated Series and Spider-Man. There's actually some crossover episodes with the Spider-Man animated series. Comic book-wise, I've read some of the major storylines. X-Men is not really, like Marvel in general, I'm more of a DC person in comic books.
Yeah.
So I haven't read as much. And of course, I've watched all the movies, unfortunately, in some cases. There's some great ones, but wow, there's some clunkers.
I would agree with that. But then I think, I love Star Wars, but Attack of the Clones is the movie. So, here we are. And then let me ask you, because
Age of Apocalypse was just a swing and a miss on so many levels. I was so excited for that one.
That's fair. Great cast, if nothing else. I will say also, I was not terribly excited about the show. I had not watched the original X-Men animated show. I had seen all the movies, and I haven't read many of the comics, but I've learned about a lot of the comics, particularly through our buddies at the Hype is My Superpower podcast, who I hope are going to be on a later episode to also talk about X-Men 97. And with them, we talked about a number of the more famous X-Men storylines, including the fairly recent Genosha plot lines that are, of course, referenced in this show.
Genosha.
Genosha.
Well, not quite.
Yeah, Genosha.
Genosha would be the Star Wars planet.
Yeah.
They're very similar.
Exactly.
Strangely.
Geonosis is the one with all the flying flying bug people who build the Death Star. Gotta trust those flying bugs.
Yeah.
But I watched the first 10 minutes of this, and I rolled my eyes really hard about 2 weeks ago.
Oh.
Mostly just I think the dialogue, in those first 10 minutes, it felt like the dialogue was a little corny. It felt like bad fight scene. It felt like all the things that I was not interested in watching.
Oh.
Hold on. But you kept a number of people kept saying how much they love the show, and I figured I needed to give it another chance. I don't want to discuss those 10 minutes necessarily, but you in particular kept saying this is a show we could talk about. What was it about this show that you really loved and that made you think this was one we wanted to talk about? And don't get worried, for audience, don't worry. By now, I know there's lots to talk about, but I want to kind of frame it that way for you, Riki, first.
I mean, X-Men in general is one of the most complicated ethical comic book franchises
Agreed.
out there. I feel like it's like relevant to the real world, and I just need to, like, since we're talking about X-Men, I just need to start off the discussion by saying, like, anyone who complains that, you know, X being like a category or a thing has become woke is being ridiculous.
Yeah.
Because, like, whether you're talking about X-Men or Star Trek, like, those things have always been woke relative to their times.
Yeah.
You know, in some cases, like, we look back and they're not quite as good as we would want them to be now. And I think that's the point of this show, is that the original X-Men, quite frankly, was not a good cartoon, like, in the long run. It was okay for its time, but I compared it to Batman and Spider-Man, and I would definitely rank it third out of those three. Like, it was my least favorite of those three. And I did go and rewatch several of the seasons of it prior to 97 coming out, and I just thought, like, this doesn't hold up in the same way that Batman the animated series does. And Spider-Man, like, I've rewatched some Spider-Man, and it's like, okay, like, it's definitely second to Batman, but I enjoyed the Spider-Man animated series from the 90s. X-Men, no, it's just like lower quality on all levels, animation, writing. The voice acting is probably the best thing about the original, and they brought back a bunch of those voice actors for the show, which is great.
Definitely.
But the subject matter of the original, like, X-Men cartoon, like, right from the beginning, was about racism, right? Or like intolerance towards other people, to mutants in this case, and the allegory to civil rights in terms of racism, or in the 90s, queer rights, was very prescient for the time, for a cartoon especially. And that's always been baked in. When I say always, it has long been baked into the DNA of the X-Men comics.
Yeah.
Like, I want to clarify, like, when people say X-Men has always been about this, that's not true. Like, not from episode or from issue 1, but once the writers, like, got their footing of the characters and realized what mutants meant in this context, in this world, it was pretty much, it was close to the beginning, I would say.
I think it's very fair. And again, like, that also isn't when comic books started being woke. Superman in the 30s, in the very first episode, was punching out landlords for overcharging tenants, and was fighting, like, helping to support unions getting organized. And I think you make a really good point about how this takes a number of those questions that the X-Men have always wrestled with and updates them in some way, and helps it to be, just to feel more relevant. To give just one example, I'm well known for hating love triangles, and there's a lot of them in this show. I'll admit that. That was my favorite part. But the simple fact that the Jean Grey storyline, the Phoenix storyline, has often been pointed out to be, and especially in the adaptations to film, fairly misogynistic, and to fall a lot into the, like, Summer Glau, super powerful, manic pixie power woman who is so powerful that she has to be controlled by men in order to protect her from herself and hurting others. And in almost every Jean Grey story, we then get the love triangle of her being fought over by Scott and Wolverine, and her kind of just in the middle. And the fact that instead, like, yeah, Wolverine still has feelings for her, and he's sad about that, and poor him. But it's very clearly the love triangle is about Scott, Jean Grey, and Madeline, who is Jean Grey's clone. And I don't love every part of how that's played out, but it still felt like someone was aware of, hey, let's maybe not do the same. And I'm guessing this is a story that's been in comics, because the stories that make it a film are only the tiniest tip of the iceberg. But I just love that, like, with the Genosha story, which I understand is fairly recent in the comics, there were definitely all sorts of references to the original and to classic stories we've heard a million times. But they really were trying to say, what do these stories look like if we're saying the same themes, but now in 2023 and 24?
Yeah, I mean, specifically, you're talking about the genocide of Genosha. I feel like that was like an early 2000s.
Oh, was it that far back? Okay, makes sense.
Which in comic book history does feel recent, right?
Yeah.
Like, compared to some Captain America from the 50s. And X-Men itself is like late 70s, early 80s, I believe,
Right.
is when they got started. But it's not been touched upon
Yeah,
before.
exactly.
Like in any of the movies. I don't even know if Genosha has been mentioned in any of the movies, probably as just like an Easter egg.
Mm.
Or I guess in the most recent, like Michael Fassbender has a mutant colony, and I don't know if they remember if they named it or not.
Okay.
But he does have like a mutant haven in the most recent Dark Phoenix.
Right. Yeah, they definitely don't call it Genosha, and it's
Mm.
very much a town instead of like its own nation.
Yeah.
But yeah, I hear that. Well, and we'll get to that. But to me, it's kind of wrapped up with the main question I want to discuss today, although we'll touch on others as well, because it's kind of the mission statement, at least. It's the name of this last 3 set of episodes that we haven't gotten yet. And I think it's a good way of describing a lot of Magneto's mission in this is tolerance extinction. What comes to mind to you when you hear that idea, that tolerance is extinction?
The first thing I thought of was Neanderthals,
Mm,
right? This idea that Neanderthals were a sub human subspecies or whatever. Like, I'm not a scientist, anthropologist, but so forgive the terminology. But they were like a proto-human,
right.
and when Homo sapiens, us, came along, the narrative is that we were superior evolutionarily, and we drove Neanderthals to extinction
Right.
because we were just better at doing stuff.
Interesting. Okay. Because me, I hear it in a very different way. And this is what I think the show is really raising in a powerful way. Then in a lot of ways, it's a question about assimilation. The question of tolerance and how, originally it was all phrased as like that was what the X-Men were fighting. And it said in the show that the X-Men are fighting the intolerance of the rest of the world. So what they're fighting for is tolerance. And I've spent a lot of my adult life working in civil rights activism of some kind or another, particularly around disability rights, but also around queer rights and around reproductive rights and things like that, but also touching on a number of issues. And more recently, this question of tolerance is how a lot of the discussion has been framed about whether the desire is to get a seat at an already existing table that isn't meant for you or to change the table. To give just an example, like this comes up a lot in queer activism, where, that a lot of the kind of more moderate pushes for acceptance are about a desire for tolerance. We want to be tolerated. And being tolerated means, okay, well, you don't really fit the heterosexual world that we've built, but we're going to tolerate the fact that you're there and you're kind of an exception. And, if you still have kids and you still have marriages and 2.3 kids and white picket fences, you're okay. And that the opposite of that is saying, no, we don't want to just be tolerated. We want to be welcomed. And part of that means saying, if the world is not built for us, then the world needs to be changed. In the disability world, to me, it's the difference between tolerance is you're going to build a world that doesn't expect people with wheelchairs, but when a wheelchair person shows up, you're going to tolerate them. You're going to make a way for them to get up, but you're not going to build a ramp. You're not going to change the nature of the world. With immigrant communities, I often hear it in terms of like, is the goal to say, okay, well, we'll tolerate the fact that you don't speak English by making sure that your kids do and helping to kind of like teaching your kids to basically be Westernized? Or is it to say, no, we're going to celebrate the fact that you speak different languages and you have different cultures and we're going to expand our idea of everything? And so maybe I'm bringing too much of that into it, but that's very much how I heard it in terms of where Magneto is coming from is that, and this is, if you listen back to the very beginning of this podcast, you hear I've always had a real sympathy for Magneto in his philosophies, not necessarily his actions, that there's something really to be said of wanting the world to tolerate you is not enough and can lead to extinction. It can lead to the assimilation of you're just kind of folded in instead of having your difference celebrated, and that if the world is built for only one kind of people, then the world has to change.
Okay. So we are, this is good. We are like picking on different sides of that phrase. Like
Yeah.
you're definitely focused on tolerance. and I'm focused on extinction.
Right.
Because like in the case of Neanderthal Homo sapien, we don't know anything about how that actually went down. We only have like, fossil records and whatnot. So, did Neanderthals tolerate Homo sapiens? We have no idea, right? So I'm focused on the extinction side of like one new species kind of butting up against an older species and what happens in that case. And like I just like did a quick Google on extinction Neanderthals, and there's one article that's the title is very provocative. It says Neanderthal extinction may have been caused by sex, not fighting, meaning like it wasn't that Homo sapiens came along and like made better spears and just killed all the Neanderthals. It's that these groups existed side by side or together because they were like they're close enough, right? They were humanoid.
I know that there's been a lot of reports of as more and more people are doing like the 23andMe DNA analysis. A lot of us are finding we have Neanderthal DNA.
Yeah. And there was crossbreeding, and the Darwinian idea of survival of the fittest, like the Homo sapien, like more DNA people, were better suited for surviving. And so like they bred more, and slowly like Neanderthal DNA was bred out.
Right.
It seems to be what happened. And that's why my mind went to this, because X-Men is like this conflict that happens in a decade or like 2 decades, right? Of Homo sapien, human, and mutants, which are called Homo superior. I feel like Magneto came up with that name. Right. And we don't know anything about the fake science of the DNA and like how close they are, but I think they're like mutants are born from humans.
Right.
And I think there have probably been cases of humans being born from mutants, right? Like the mutation thing, the X gene as they call it,
right?
I think is pretty random or possibly like recessive in some cases. But when I think of like tolerance of extinction, like I think yes, basically like what I described about the Neanderthal situation is going to happen in the fictional X-Men universe.
Right.
But that's like over centuries or millennia, right? That Homo sapiens will be bred out just because they're inferior to Homo superior.
Right.
In like these capacities, like the mutations, their abilities. And so like why wouldn't we want a society where, superhuman power people can like construct buildings in an instant and whatnot?
Well, I think you're so right. I think that's part of what makes it such a great phrase, because it's kind of it can be used in all directions, and often is, because there's the concern of, if our goal is tolerance, does that mean we're just going to be assimilated and we're going to be like the Neanderthals and kind of bred out? Or is it, as you say, the opposite going to happen? Is it the human concern, some of the humans, that if they tolerate the X-Men, then it will eventually lead to their own extinction? And so they're the diet like, we have to not tolerate them because that will lead to our extinction. Right. And then I also there's one moment where Wolverine is fighting one of the Sentinels, or one of the people, kind of more sentient Sentinels. I got lost in a lot of the details there. But that person,
I can help with that.
What that person says to Wolverine, calls Wolverine a Neanderthal. And
I didn't catch that.
Part of that's because I think Wolverine isn't like a genius like Beast or Professor X or Magneto. He's much more bestial in that regard than Beast even. But also I think it's supposed to be one more part of this exact thing you're talking about, of like, even to the X-Men perspective, there might be someone else who looks at them as the lower class, lower rank, and stuff like that.
Yeah. Obviously, like the conceit of the X-Men, like this accelerated rate of mutation, right? Where suddenly, like within one generation, you have a Magneto who can control magnetism and electricity, is very like fictionalized. But I think it does the allegory to other things in the real world, as you have touched upon, is very important.
Right.
Because like it shouldn't be that way, right? Like I am presenting this argument that in the long run, evolutionarily, tolerance is extinction. That it's kind of inevitable.
Right.
That we the species like will continue to evolve and get better at whatever needs to happen. Like I fundamentally believe in that.
Mm-hmm.
But it doesn't mean that when someone with new abilities comes along that it's a threat to us who don't have abilities. In fact, like I would argue that many athletes, right, like professional athletes, are quote unquote mutants.
Mm-hmm.
That they have like extraordinary abilities compared to many of us. What's the swimmer's
Michael
name?
Phelps, yeah.
Yes,
Yeah, he's an
that
absolute
that
genetic freak in terms, like, not in a bad
yeah,
way, but in terms of like he is at the absolute extreme in terms of just like arm length and his wingspan in that regard.
right. And he is evolutionarily better designed as a swimmer
Mm-hmm.
than the average human being. And we not only do we tolerate him, we celebrate him, right? Like we celebrate these athletes who can do things that we can't do. And so like it's very unusual that the allegory breaks down in terms of like actual physical mutation in this case, where these people have these extraordinary gifts. Although I will point out that we are seeing pushback in cases of like gender issues, right? Like non-male athletes who have like higher levels of testosterone, that people are trying to control that or like ban them from sports, etc. And in some cases, like I believe like that's just like natural evolution. Like those people have, yes, they have like a genetic biological advantage, but we have always,
But so does
maybe
Caitlin
not always,
Clark
but we've
when it comes to women's sports. Like,
yeah.
no, I think you're so very right there. And that allows me to get into the reason why I started with this question, because about halfway through the show, or no, about I guess 2/3 through the way, because it's when the line is said in the show, a character says Magneto was right. And it's one of the villains, and so maybe we're not supposed to believe her necessarily, but I was like, oh, okay. And I messaged Riki, and I was like, okay, that's what I want our focus to be. But then almost immediately, it did what, and I'm not going to go too far into this, because if you heard me complain about this and a lot of other times we talked about X-Men, the writers decided that because Magneto was starting to seem like he could be right to some characters in his goals and his perspective, his actions and his methods had to go so far over the top that nobody would want to support him. And I found this incredibly frustrating, in part because at this point, I just think it's lazy writing. I think and it's something that I've seen, and Paul really helped to point this out to me. Killmonger makes a lot of good points, but he's just too far over the top. So we have to favor our hero, Black Panther. In Falcon and the Winter Soldier, I think the flag burners, the flag smashers, they had really good points, but because they were a little too radical, it was easy for us to ignore their message. And the show was telling us to ignore their message because they were being too radical in what they were doing. A lot of shows and a lot of movies do this. And I think right now it has very particular relevance because right now in this country and around the world, we're experiencing a moment where people are expressing messages about how upset they are about the horrible things happening in Gaza. Not all of them are doing it the way I would like them to do it. And the conversation is focusing much more on that than it is on the message itself. And so I just say that not to start that debate, but just to get into like why this matters. And I think I was particularly frustrated with that because it really seemed like this show was trying to say, what if we can grow beyond the Professor X is always right, Magneto is always wrong dichotomy that has been the heart of all of the X-Men for so long. And I know not a lot of the comics. And I know that the Genosha plot line, a lot of it's about the idea of Professor X and Magneto coming to terms with each other. And this whole idea of separation, again, to kind of put it in the frame of the civil rights idea, it's much more the Marcus Garvey idea of let's just all go to Africa, or let's, a whole population saying, let's not try to either assimilate or change the society we're in. Let's separate into a different society. So I guess I should find a question here rather than just ranting, and I apologize for that. But I'm kind of curious your thoughts on this. If you had any of that same frustration about Magneto making some interesting points, but then deciding, as the X-Men all say, to just declare war on the whole world.
No, because fundamentally, like from a storytelling aspect, Magneto and Professor X need to be at odds with each other. So it was definitely interesting and fun to have Magneto take over the school and the X-Men in the absence of Charles. But when Charles chose to come back, like there was no way they were going to work together, like period.
I mean, but my understanding is that
And
they do in a lot of the more recent comics, especially around Genosha.
I don't know
And they
specifically.
certainly do in Days of Future Past until again the writers go, oh wait, no, Magneto's the enemy. We have to have him do something that makes no sense whatsoever for the character in this movie because he's the enemy.
Yeah, what I wanted was uh Cyclops, Scott Summers, to side with Magneto. And I thought it
Yeah,
was going to
I
happen,
can see that.
and it didn't. Because that I thought that's where we were going with this franchise in the future. A potential like X-Men versus Avengers storyline, because like they teased Captain America.
Right.
He showed up halfway through the season and was very confrontational with Rogue. I thought we were going to go that way, and in those storylines, Cyclops ends up siding with Magneto, and Magneto was right, or is right, is kind of like the phrase from that era, where he leads, like Scott and Magneto lead like a more extreme, not the extreme X-Men, but a more extreme faction of X-Men that is less about Professor X's message of tolerance.
Right. Well, certainly, and I think that's part of why the Genosha storyline is so interesting to me, because I think when Magneto is saying we have to be willing to stand up for ourselves and to be proud of ourselves, because trying to fit in and trying to convince they're always going to be scared of us, and so trying to, like, convince them that we're not scary, convince them to love us, doesn't work. We need to just stand up for ourselves. I love him. When he becomes, as you said, like, homo superius, that we are better and so we should look at them as like a lesser race, that's when I roll my eyes a lot. And to me, so I realized we never actually did much of a plot summary in this, and a lot of it is there's a kind of number of side stories. There's a whole, they love triangles in this one. There's a whole love triangle between Rogue, Cajun boy whose name I'm forgetting for the moment. Gambit, thank you. Rogue, Gambit, and Magneto. There's all the stuff about Scott and the two Jean Greys with a little bit of Wolverine thrown in. There's a number of different ones like that play out. But the point is, putting aside all the love stories and some of the side adventures, the main idea of this is that Professor X is thought to be dead. Magneto has come to take over the school, and there's all this discussion now, Genosha, and will Genosha be recognized by the United Nations as its own nation? And Genosha, the whole point is like, okay, you guys don't like us, you're not going to tolerate us, we're going to all go over here and do our own thing, and who cares about you anymore? And then they get attacked in Genosha, and that's where Magneto gets into his, you have to, we have to fight back, because even when we try to go off and be by ourselves and not ask them to tolerate us, they attack us anyway. And then there's all sorts of other plot complications around, because the Sentinels are back, and then there's lots and lots of plots and lots of enemies. I thought a couple too many plot lines, to be honest. Professor X is off with his alien Empress Queen, and it's a lot. But the point, I think that's the base of the story is, and now it looks like at the end that Magneto was killed. Gambit was definitely killed. And now Magneto has kind of taken action to change the whole world, to fight back against the whole world. And we're going into the last episode with our heroes trying to both stop Magneto and trying to stop the Sentinels and the people who are behind them. Now that you're giving kind of that summary again, give us some focus again, Riki.
What do you think it means that Magneto was right? What was he right about? Like that, I think that's the fundamental question
Right.
that has to be answered?
That, to me, he's right that asking people to tolerate you is never the answer. That asking people to say, please don't be afraid of us, please love us, we are in the weak position, you are in the strong position, we don't want to challenge that, we want to accept that you have the right to decide who sits at your table, that all the things that Professor X wants to do, that he's wrong. And that he did get us to the situation where the Sentinels are now kind of starting to take over. And because you can't, that doesn't work. And because I think a lot of people couch the whole conversation often as, oh, it's just Martin Luther King versus Malcolm X. And I think that inspired it. But in a lot of ways, it's better to understand it as, if they're anything, they're the understanding that white people had of those two ideas. And I think that, like, to me, it's not that I think Professor X is wrong because he's Martin Luther King. It's that I think he's wrong because he's the more passive, the very tolerable, the white version of the Martin Luther King story that we like to tell ourselves because it's what we can tolerate. Because in that story, he's not a radical. He's not socialist as he actually was. He's not radically anti-Vietnam as he actually was. And so to me, when I say Magneto is right, it's that Mystique trying to hide and not show people that she's blue is never going to make people be okay with her. And that it is only by saying, here we are, you don't have to just tolerate us, but we are part of your society. You have to accept that and change that. And we're going to fight back against anything else. It's the only way towards acceptance. It's the only way towards building the better society.
Interesting. Okay.
But then when he starts to say we have to kill everyone to do it, or that we're better, that's when I lose them. But it's those parts of Magneto's message that I think are right.
But that's what people are saying. Like, I think Dr. Cooper, when she says Magneto was right, is saying that basically, yeah, that human beings will never accept mutants, and so conflict is the only way to resolve this, and just like see which side comes out on top. So, like, when I think of Magneto is right, I personally like fundamentally disagree. Like, I think Magneto is wrong. I think he's an interesting character in some of his philosophy, but like fundamentally he's wrong. But also, like, Charles is wrong. I think the idea of Genosha in this fictional world is wrong in that it's essentially segregation. Like, it's a segregated nation.
Right.
Like, they present it as a safe haven for mutants, but it basically means you're taking mutants out of everywhere else. And so, like, when I think of the idea of tolerance, I think like Charles's message has been coexistence, right? And I don't see Genosha as coexistence. I see it as segregation, I guess, is where I'm going to. So they're both wrong, and you have to pick and choose how you handle things. I think insofar as like Genosha exists as a nation, it's better, and especially if they had gained representation in the United Nations and a voice in things, I think that's better than just like having mutants be persecuted everywhere. But I think the ultimate goal that Charles, like his ideas were pursuing, is like a kind of universal coexistence of just like mutants and humans living alongside each other and respecting each other and doing the things that they're good at and celebrating that.
There's a couple of things I want to pick up on there. And this is, again, why I think it's a great show, because it raises these issues. I hear why it seems to you like segregation. For me, there's a very big difference between segregation and separatism, in that segregation is generally enforced by the, ruling group, and it's about limitations on what the minority group can do. It's about, you can only have these jobs, you can only live in this area, all of this stuff. And although you get to have your own neighborhoods and you get to have your own communities and whatever it is, and schools, we still at the end of the day are the ones in charge of your stuff. Separatism, which I know was created very much as a response to segregation and the attempts of assimilation, is very different to me, because the power is fundamentally in the group that is choosing voluntarily to separate itself. Because in Genosha, there is no group of humans that would, there shouldn't be, at least, they get to set their own national policies. They get to have their own elections. They get to decide who rules them. And they're trying to do that peacefully, and in partnership, therefore, with the human nations of the world. And I think most importantly, there are no rules that say that therefore all mutants have to go to Genosha, that they aren't allowed to still live at the X Manor in New York and all these other places. And so to me, I think, like, I see why it looks like segregation, but I think the power difference is so different. Is a dumb sentence, but you know what I mean? That to me, it feels very different, and segregation doesn't really feel like the right word there.
I mean, from a nation in a bottle, you're right.
Mm-hmm.
Genosha being a mutant nation means they have all the power there, but do they have power on the world stage? We don't really know. Like, we don't unfortunately get to see how it plays out. Like, they were, I think, just petitioning for UN membership.
Mm-hmm.
But I feel like the future of Genosha, like, were it allowed to continue, would be one of, like, a segregation on a world political stage where they are kept powerless
Mm-hmm.
in terms of, like, global politics. And then I also do believe, like, that the end result for mutants in other nations is more severe persecution. Like, having this place, Genosha, as a quote safe haven, would lead, and I think there may have even been scenes of this, would lead to basically go to your home, go back to your home, go to your nation, right? Like, you don't belong in our nation, go to your nation type stuff. Which happens in the real world, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like, go back to where you came from is a very popular racist nationalist phrase.
Yep. No, I think you're right. And to me, I think what I like about the Genosha, the second thing I was going to say is that I think the other thing that Genosha does is, to me, what happens in Genosha in this show is what, for me, finally proves Professor X totally wrong. Because Professor X wanting benevolence and wanting everyone to live together, I think, isn't a problem. I think you're right. That's a great goal. It's that he wants to start by, he wants to be the beggar at the human table saying, please love us. Instead of saying, no, we are just as equal as you are, and we're going to fight for that, instead of just, asking for it kindly. And again, I want to be clear that I think conflict and fighting for something don't necessarily have to mean violence. And in a comic book show, of course, that's what we go to, and that's what Magneto jumps to. So it's not that I'm saying every minority group should only be using violence, but I think that's the difference between, so much of Professor X's appeal seems to be they hate us and they're afraid of us because they're scared of us, and they're scared that we're living next door to them, and they're scared that we're infiltrating their government, and they're scared that we're going to hurt them. But if everyone's away in Genosha, that fear should go away, and yet still the humans attack them. And so to me, that's where really I have to look at it and go, this to me is proof Professor X is wrong.
Well, I mean, as is often the case in, I think, this discussion, we disagree. Like,
Yeah,
I like, for me, when you said Professor X begging at the table, or whatever the phrasing was, I thought of the scene where he is, in my opinion, negotiating with President Kelly, the president of the United States, in this fictional world. And he was discussing his X-Men and what they were doing to stop this situation.
Right.
And it didn't come off as begging to me. It came off as like, hey, like, we're going to take care of this, give us time. But when we're done, you owe us.
Yeah.
Right. Like, this is gonna end with the X-Men saving the day because it's a superhero show, and us, like, it doesn't, which would be an amazing season finale. I believe it's gonna end with the X-Men saving the day. And
I'm afraid you're right, which is gonna be, I think, a negative point, but you're probably right.
And Professor X having a seat at the table, or at least having a stronger negotiation
Right.
a point of negotiation with the president,
Well, but he
and
also,
being able to say, because we helped you, because we saved the world, literally, like, we're going to need you to help enact some legislation and better policies in the country.
but he does all that after he has said to the X-Men, "I was wrong." Like, I don't think that's his. I think that is his stance in part because of what he's learned through everything that's happened in this series.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of things he's wrong about. I think I said that. I think they're both wrong, but
I,
I would say, like, I am, like, I don't know, 60-40
yeah.
Professor X.
I just mean that I don't think that his speech with the president at the end there represents, to me, that is Professor X changing away from what he has been through most of the show and what he's been through most of this of the plot in general. That is what I'm critiquing. Like, I think Magnus, I want to keep calling him Eric, but I know it's Magneto would look
Well, it's both.
right. Well, I think that character would look at, if he got to, like, watch a hidden cam of Professor X talking to the president, he'd go, "Finally, you're learning, Charles." Like, I think that to me is much more where Professor X should be than where he is throughout the rest of the show.
I mean, that's an interpretation. I think at this point in the story, he would be like, "No, I'm going to kill the president."
Which to me, again, is the bad writing, but I hear what you're saying.
But it's his character. Like, that's how his character is written. That's how his character has often been written. So,
well, I guess this goes to kind of a more meta question. Because I think you're right. On some level, this is just a disagreement you and I have, and that's great. And it's great that a show can give both of us a place to feel that we're right. You said at one point that the story always has to be, Charles and Magneto are on the other side, on different sides, and that Charles is going to be on the good side. And remember, this is kind of similar to what we were saying way back when we were talking about One Piece and then about anime. I don't think it's a good idea that stories have things like that always has to be true. To me, that's when it just becomes cliche. That's when it becomes lazy writing. I think I'm enjoying this series, but I think these last couple of episodes have really left a bad taste in my mouth. I really wanted Magneto to be the good guy in this, and either for Charles to be totally gone and the whole thing to be about kind of the Logan idea of, yeah, Charles was wrong and Magneto was too far too. But now that Magneto has to be in charge of the X-Men, he has to mellow out somewhat. And I know it's bad to just, say, like, oh, I wanted the story to be this way. This is the story we're getting. But my point is more just the idea that the story always has to be this way. I think that is, if we always know how the story has to be, then why are we telling the same story again?
Yeah, I mean, I think this is something we've disagreed on in the past, and I certainly stand firm that we have to evaluate things both as fiction in terms of, like, how the narrative plays out in the fictional world, but also fiction as, like, what it represents to us in the real world and how we react to it and how we learn from it. And I think my position has long been that fiction, especially, like, I mean, this show is quite violent for a cartoon, right? I was very surprised by some of the actions that happened.
A lot of people died. This is not G.I. Joe.
Yeah. But fundamentally, it's a cartoon. It is, quote unquote, for kids, or like, it is, maybe it's not for kids, but it should be allowed for kids to watch this, right? And enjoy it. And to me, that means that you cannot make the villain too sympathetic. You can't make the villain correct in the end, because fiction has to teach people, and especially kids, what's right and what's wrong. And it's like one of the fundamental things that I absolutely believe, like, Superman shouldn't kill. Like, we get bad Superman, that it's interesting stories, but he's Superman. If he kills, like, you start teaching kids, like, oh, like, even if you're a good guy, it's okay to kill. And, like, that's a very basic way to think about it, but it starts to creep in and erode our morality, I think, as individuals and as a society, if we allow Superman to kill. That's just, like, my kind of, like, big take on it. So I always want the X-Men and Professor X to be right and, quote unquote, win in the end. in this.
And it's interesting because I disagree for the exact same reason. Because, and again, it is a simplification to say that X is Martin Luther King and Magneto is Malcolm X, but there is a degree to which, like, most movements have to have more of the assimilationist side and more of the hell to you with side. And for a lot of the time that the X-Men was written, the general societal perception was that Martin Luther King was right and Malcolm X was wrong. And in recent years, we've started to really question that, in part questioning, like, are there actually active views of it? But there's been a much more sympathy, I think, for very good reason, for Malcolm X. I don't want a story where the villain wins. I want a story where we say maybe Magneto isn't always the villain. And because for me,
Sure.
and I see a direct line between, you know, you can advocate for your rights as mutants, but you have to do it in the right way and you have to be nice about it, is directly connected to me to, you can protest for your rights, but you can't break buildings. You have to say the right things. You have to be nice about it. I think you're right. We have to teach kids the right messages. I think there's something very dangerous when every story about someone who fights for their rights always has a character who also wants to fight for their rights but goes too far. Because to me, it's really saying, like, yes, you can protest, but you have to do it in a nice, good way. Don't be Killmonger. Don't be the Flag Smashers. Don't be Magneto. So
okay.
I guess I think we're totally in agreement that it should have good messages. I think we're just kind of in disagreement about what message is it actually giving.
I also think, like, fundamentally, so the whole Martin Luther King, Malcolm X thing, I believe is, like, similar to the idea of, like, have the X-Men always been woke? Like, no. Like, the plan was not like we're going to design these two characters,
No, clearly,
based on these historical figures, but they've evolved in that way through the storytelling in the comics,
right?
And probably inspired by to evolve in that way. But they were not, like, initially conceived of to be these two figures,
Right? By no means.
But it became an interesting dynamic. Where I'm going with this is that the dichotomy should not be Professor X is right, Magneto is wrong, or the other way around. It's that they both have good things to add to this message,
mm-hmm.
And the people that are wrong are the Friends of Humanity, the extremist racist group. Bolivar Trask, the designer of the Sentinels, Henry Gyrick, the man who assassinates Professor X, Bastion, right? Like the future Sentinel, the Terminator Sentinel, that's come from the future. Like, to me, like, by making this dichotomy of Professor X and Magneto, like, that's the whole divide and conquer.
Right.
By keeping those two factions divided, the extremist actual enemies on the other side are able to take advantage of that. And that should be the message.
Right.
Is that we have disagreements, but we should work together to fight the actual extremism on the other side that is a danger.
Yeah.
And when I think of, like, messaging and politics, one of the things that I really go back to is Bernie Sanders has been, by some people decried as an extremist in terms of his political economic policies. And he never won, like, a nomination for president. But by being in those races, by having the debates and the discussions, I believe he fundamentally pushed the Democratic Party and, ultimately President Biden's policies to the left more than he would have wanted. So I find value in that, in having differences of opinions, but we fundamentally agree, like, on the overall direction. And in these discussions, like, we kind of navigate to a medium path that may not satisfy anyone, but ultimately is for the better.
And I think if we'd gotten that story, I would have absolutely loved it. If it had been a story of, because Magneto is now in this place of being in charge of children and also of just having a much higher level of responsibility for things, that he has to moderate himself and that Charles has to see that Magneto was right about a lot of, like, that Magneto was maybe wrong about his methods, but that Charles was wrong about his goals, and the two have to meet in the middle and then work together against these enemies. I would love that. But that's not what we got.
Yeah.
We got
No, because we have to have conflict. And that, like, we have
go ahead, I'm sorry.
We have a beautiful moment in Genosha, like the celebration, the ballroom celebration, right, was like the high point for mutants, for Genosha, and for Magneto. Like he was about to be appointed, I don't know, chancellor or ruler or whatever of Genosha, and he was looking to be that like more balanced ruler, but it was because of an extremist attack, which is terrible.
Yeah.
But that, like, for the story to continue, that had to happen, because if that doesn't happen, then we just get like Magneto sitting on a board in a board meeting discussing politics, right? And that, like, you and I may want that, but that doesn't make for an interesting TV show.
See, I disagree, because I think you could have kept the attack. The attack still happens. Magneto gets upset about it. Charles comes back. They have a reconciliation. And then these last episodes are about Charles and Magneto leading the mutants together against the Sentinels. And the 8 other groups that I can't all name, because again, I got very confused by time traveling and all that nonsense. Like, I think that would have been a much better story than what we're getting today, where they have to fight both Magneto and the Sentinels.
Well, we don't know where it's going to end up.
True.
Because, like, for the X-Men story, like, we believe it's going to continue. I can't remember if a season 2 has been confirmed, but I highly doubt Magneto is actually going to be killed.
Oh yeah,
and he will continue. He should continue to be a foil. Hopefully, that will, from my point of view, will be a little too extreme, but will still like drive this discussion.
Yeah, I think that's fair. And one other thing I just wanted to say, just on the Martin Luther King Malcolm X thing one more time, I think I started to say this, but I probably wasn't clear. I do think we're using those as placeholders, I think, for a large discussion, because to me, it's not about those two specific men. It's about that most protest movements have always had more of an assimilationist and more of a, conflict side. In the 90s, when, and still to this day, and throughout the time in between, when it was, as you said, kind of more of an allegory about queer rights, there were still, there was groups like the Human Rights Campaign that was really trying to focus on giving gay people acceptance into mainstream heterosexual world. And then more groups like, ACT UP that were like, no, screw that. We want to blow open the doors of the heterosexual society and, like, change the definitions of how people understand relationships and stuff like that. So it's definitely not limited to those two characters or the Black experience and civil rights or anything like that. There's a lot more I'm sure we could talk about. We'll probably do a couple more episodes on this show over the next couple weeks and months. But I know also, Riki, you wanted to talk a little bit about fan service and the way that this is kind of tapping into nostalgia for people who love the original and also changing that. The floor is yours.
Okay. So my thesis is, what's wrong with fan service? Or, like, fan service is good. I want to be serviced as a fan. That's a weird phrase, but I want to be serviced as a fan because I love these properties. I love comic books. I love, science fiction, Star Wars, Star Trek. So from a broad perspective, like, when I hear the phrase, like, that's just fan service, I'm like, what's wrong with being serviced? That said, I think you have to do it in the right way, which that's my opinion, right? But what is the right way? But you have to do it in a way that still allows for good storytelling, good character development, both in terms of, like, the property you're watching and the broader franchise.
Right.
So in this one, like, one of the things I said was, I love the fan service moments with Morph. When they are fighting and they transform into other characters that are not on the show but are in the universe, that's pure fan service, right? When Morph changes into Quicksilver or Juggernaut or Psylocke, for the first couple episodes, I got every time. It's like, oh, Psylocke's here. It's like, no, it's just Morph.
Morph Smash was a great moment in a fight.
Yeah. And that's just pure fan service and probably like trailer fodder. Like if you put that image in a trailer, be like, oh, like the Hulk is in this show. And that's fine because it's also like contextually that is their power.
Yeah.
To change and like use the abilities. And so it's fine. The recently we're going to talk about this more in depth on another podcast, but Star Wars has been doing fan service that I don't like because it doesn't fit into the context. And I'm specifically thinking of the Bad Batch season 3.
Let's just say that there's a
with
character who appears briefly
Yeah.
mentioning the character's name.
Okay. There's a character that appears in the trailer, and they devote an episode to that character, and they don't really explain what the heck is going on.
Yep.
So it's like, I don't know. I like fan service, but I also think it has to be in service of what is going on.
I think I'm with you, and I will say, if you listen to the Star Wars Generations podcast, you'll hear me speak at length about the topic that Riki is mentioning in our previous episodes. And also, around the time that this episode comes out, I think a few days later, we're going to have another episode of Star Wars Generations that Riki is going to be a guest on, where we're going to talk about the Bad Batch, and that topic will get discussed. And I think I have a similar kind of lens to you. For me, there's two things I think that can make fans, like, I just don't like the word because I do think it's a kind of negative way. It's kind of like oh, this character's a Mary Sue, like it's just a way of saying something's negative without actually saying anything. To me, though, when it comes to things like that, when it's like it's giving a payoff to the people who've seen the previous content or read the previous content or played or whatever, there are two possible problems. One is, as you said, where it feels like it doesn't make sense in the story, when it just seems like it's kind of shoehorned in. And for me, this has kind of a corollary, which is that I think sometimes it can make the world feel very small. If every person you encounter 20 years later from this huge group is a member of the specific group that you happen, like, if every Jedi who we encounter 20 years later who survived Order 66 are all Jedi who we already knew, that feels a little off because, like, no, there were lots of other Jedi and some of them would have, and it just makes the world feel like, oh yeah, those were the only 6 Jedi in it. We know that's not the case, but the same thing happens in Star Trek, in like any show it can be, where like if you don't have new characters showing up a lot, it makes the world feel very small. The other real lens to me is, does a person who hasn't seen that other property, are they able to understand what's going on?
Exactly.
And to me, I thought this did it very, very well. In that,
meaning X-Men?
Yeah. In that, I think, like, you're right, Morph was kind of great. Like, I could catch most of those references as someone who's just seen the movies. And if I didn't catch a reference, I still enjoyed it a lot. There were a lot
of, it's probably like visually a little confusing. You're like, who is that character?
Right.
But then like they show the transition of changing back to themselves or to someone else. So you start to understand, like, okay, this is just how Morph fights.
Right. And to some extent, I think like some of the names of X-Men are a little bit too on the nose, but having the character be literally named Morph helps to explain a lot of that. I also thought they threw in some little jokes that were just brilliant. Like, for example, when they are giving, I forget who it is, I think it's maybe Cable, kind of a yellow jumpsuit, and
oh my gosh.
And they say, what did you expect? Black leather. And that's an exact throwback to the joke in the first X-Men movie, where they're making fun of the yellows. And I was just like, that is brilliant. That is a brilliant meta thing. I think where this went off the rails was, and I'm wondering if it was just too many storylines, or if it's because it was too much kind of fan service or Easter eggs. I found it very hard to follow. I felt like there were just too many plot lines. And, to me, Professor X is missing and has to come back is an interesting storyline. All the stuff about the Empress and him maybe marrying her and then deciding not to, and the conflict on her planet, felt completely irrelevant to the story. Storm's story of kind of like fighting her way back and doing this felt really interesting to me. But all the stuff with Forge and his demons, I just didn't get it. And same with like I know a little bit about Trask and the Sentinels, but once we introduce time traveling and Bastion and Cable, and some people are connected, plus I was so completely lost. And I don't know if that's just overwriting or if it is that people who know those stories a lot well, you know, the kind of thing where like you see the tip of the iceberg. And so people who are able to know those stories a lot well are able to go, oh yeah, okay, I get it. I know already all the story about Professor X and this empire. So I'm glad we're lampshading it a bit. So I don't know if that's a case of too much fan service or just me not being smart enough to follow all the plots, or just that there were too many storylines in the show. But for me, that was the one real downside of it. Well, other than what they did with Magneto, it was the one real downside, I thought.
It was basically a problem of this being X-Men season 6, I believe. Yeah. I think there were 5 seasons of the original run, and a lot of stuff happened, including stuff with the Shi'ar Empire in space, including time travel multiple times. I mean, they did their own Days of Future Past. And I know that the showrunner had put out like some recommended viewing of the original series. Like, these are the episodes you should watch to kind of like catch up or like understand some of the backstory. And it's unfortunately just like too much.
Yeah.
Like, even if you watch those episodes, it might be too much. Like Sinister, right? Like Mr. Sinister exists and like he has something to do with clones. But unless you watch the original series or know like Sinister's backstory from the comics, it's like, well, what's going on here?
Yeah.
Like, who is this guy? And it's hard to have all of that for a season 6.
Yeah.
To explain it all adequately, I think. Especially because they couldn't use I'm just gonna say couldn't use the footage, right? Like previously on the X-Men, here's footage from the original cartoon. Like you can't have that.
Yeah, the animation
so unfortunately,
so much worse
yeah, there's no good way to explain some of this stuff to catch people up.
And I will say I tried watching the X-Men show. I watched most of season 1, the original. I really didn't like it. I'm not saying it's bad. No, I love it. You also seems not a huge fan.
And I think it's pretty bad, all things considered. Like, it's fun, but it doesn't hold up, is what I would say.
My point, though, was just I recognize that I may sound like a hypocrite here, and so I want to make very clear what I mean. Because I did say a lot while talking about Ahsoka that I think this is Rebels season 5, and I'm okay with that. And I think it is. There's no problem with making a show that's mostly for people who have already watched the previous material. And so I think I should amend what I was saying a little bit to make clear. It is a reason why the show doesn't work as well as it could for me, a new viewer. But if it works really well for the people who did know all those storylines and so we're able to follow all this perfectly, then I think it's great that exists. And I would rather have a show like, because again, this is the kind of thing we're playing. Not every show and every movie has to be for everyone. And so if the end result of this is that I can still enjoy a lot of it, but I recognize that a lot of it isn't really for me because it expects me to know all about the show that I don't know all about. I will say, I think if your goal is to reach a wider audience, you didn't do a good job of that. But if your goal is really to reach the people who already know this stuff, which I think is a perfectly legitimate goal with a sequel or a new season, then they did a great job of it.
So, well, yeah, I mean, this is where I was saying, like, you have to fundamentally tell a good story.
Right.
And I think you're right. Like, the most confusing parts are the time travel elements, because they just start the show with Bishop being on the team and he's from the future, and they kind of like drop a few exposition things about the future and time travel, but time travel is complicated, like, to fictionalize and to explain adequately. So I always say, like, you're better off not trying to explain time travel and just like using it as a plot device. But when it's the whole plot, when it's like the basis of your villain, you kind of have to explain it. And I agree. Like, I don't think they did an adequate job of that. But like, from the perspective of the story that this show was telling, I think, especially like through Genosha like through I think the episode is called Remember It, right?
Mhm.
Like because of Gambit. That was like peak
Yeah.
X-Men to me. And yeah, like I kind of rolled my eyes when Bastion was revealed as a villain because it's like, here we go with the time travel. I don't think this quite fits in. It felt a little shoehorned, but they had to shoehorn a lot.
Yeah.
Like it's a lot of storylines, and I agree. Like unfortunately, the Forge thing, life death, just got kind of shoved in a weird spot. It's and I say unfortunate because that is like one of the best storylines, like in X Men,
Interesting.
Forge and Storm,
Mm.
and I wish they had given them more time to develop because it felt like they met and then like the episode ends and the next episode they're in a relationship question mark.
Mhm.
Like I think they are, but it wasn't really developed enough in a way that made me like buy into it,
Yeah.
I guess.
There were a couple of hand wavy things about relationships that I was sort of like had a raised eyebrow about. Magneto being Rogue's teacher and then them developing a
Oh
relationship was a little like,
yeah.
I don't know what
I mean, given the supposed ages of those characters, I was very uncomfortable
yeah.
with that.
But I will say
And I always have been.
but I will say about Forge, this is another character who has a prosthetic leg who I absolutely loved. And they didn't really make a storyline out of his prosthetic leg. They didn't have to.
Mm-hmm.
But if you listened when there wasn't dialogue, you could hear that his leg made a little bit of a noise every time he took a step, which I just was like, that level of detail to my experience felt like that's what representation should be. And I was just so happy about that.
And I definitely wish they had given Forge more time, more screen time, more
Yeah.
backstory time, right? Because there was a nice tender moment where Storm says like, "May I ask?" Right? Like, and I think he says like, "I was in a war" or something, and
Yeah.
like that's it. That's all we get. And it's I think I was curious on your take because in a way, you know, we've talked about disability and not just like hand waving it with magic.
Mm-hmm.
In a way, like his mutation is kind of magic. He's like a techno mutant or something like that, and it is a mechanical genius. But it was still like real. It was like real prosthetics, right? Like so. How did that feel?
It, it's funny because I was wondering why the noise meant so much to me, and I think it's exactly what you're just talking about because my prosthetic makes a noise. And
Hmm.
so even though, yes, this is a much more high-tech version, it still feels like something I can connect to in a way that like
Yeah.
Misty Knight's arm, and granted I have a prosthetic leg, not a prosthetic arm, but still doesn't feel at all like my experience.
So it's like still grounded in reality, even
Yeah.
though he had like kind of a magical way of making them.
And I think also, and granted, these are very different parts of Marvel, but it is all parts of the MCU. Well, I think I don't know if this is canon in the MCU, but who the heck knows about that anymore? Um, if we hadn't gotten Echo, I might have felt differently. But because again, one thing people talk about representation is yes, give us a story that is about our issues and focuses on our issues. But then also that doesn't mean that if you don't want to talk about our issues, we shouldn't appear. We should just be in a lot of stories because we're everywhere. And that's true about every group. Some stories should be about queer rights. Some people should be about just queer people existing while they're dealing with something else. And I think the fact that Echo exists, the fact that there have been some other great pieces of disability and specifically prosthetic and wheelchair representation meant that my needs for this were a lot low because I didn't feel like, oh my God, I finally have a character with a prosthetic leg. I need everything about the story. It was just like, cool, here's yet another person with a prosthetic leg, and he's doing other things, and that's awesome.
Mhm. Yeah, and they addressed it, but didn't. I thought it was a very respectful way that Storm asked
Agreed.
as well.
Agreed. Totally agreed then. Well,
So for me personally, like my my representation, Asian,
mhm.
the character of Jubilee, I loved because in the original X-Men, she just didn't feel Asian. She's supposed to be Asian, never felt Asian in the original X-Men cartoon.
Mhm.
In this one, she's drawn like in a much more visually Asian way and is played by an Asian voice actress, Holly Chow. And the original actress, I'm looking at her, Alison Court, is a white woman.
Mm-hmm.
And my understanding is that they approached her and said, hey, like a lot of the original voice cast said, hey, do you want to come back and play Jubilee again? And she said no. She declined and said, I think you should cast an Asian voice actress.
That's awesome.
And I believe they still got Allison on the show, like in a different role.
Yeah.
But that, like, that whole thing is a big positive.
Yeah.
For me.
I really love when things happen. Like I kind of wish it'd been the show being like, hey, we are bringing back a lot of the cast. I hope you understand we want to get an Asian actress this time, but we'd love to, like, I wish it'd come from that direction, but I still think it's awesome that those things are happening. And me will be that they both it. Yeah, who knows?
It's not clear like how the discussion went.
Yeah. But even so, yeah, I think that's a great kind. And way back when we did episodes about The Last of Us, we talked about that same kind of a thing where sometimes there were white voice actors for non-white characters, and then they changed that, but they kept those voice actors in other ways and stuff like that. So just gotta love that.
Yeah, and it's like the voice acting is very subtle. Like, she does not have, like, Jubilee is a second generation. Like, I believe she was born in the United States, so she's never had like a exaggerated accent in any way.
Right.
But it's still nice, and like I can, like, it feels more comfortable to me. Like, even my voice, like, I don't have like a very Asian accent. Every once in a while, like, something creeps in, like, or like if I'm speaking like Japanese words in an English sentence, right? But it's just nice.
Yeah, no, I can definitely see that. And I thought there were elements of her character that, it felt like I not just the way she looked, but that felt to me like, yeah, this is an accurate representation of an Asian American teenager. Which, again, it's not stereotype or anything like that, but just like it felt right to that, what that character is supposed to be, as well as just being a teenager.
Yeah, and this Sunspot voice actor, Sunspot, Roberto, was also, I enjoyed the performance, especially like when he speaks Portuguese every once in a while, like just drops a Portuguese phrase in.
Which, I don't know if you had subtitles on. The subtitles specifically say Brazilian Portuguese, which I like, because apparently it is a little bit kind of like, Creole French or something. And I'll just say, I just loved his character in general, because you had a character who was brown, who had a bit of an accent, who we learned is Brazilian, also being the entitled, spoiled rich kid, which, like, it's a nice, like, obviously, like, it's not that we should like whitewash the fact or unwhitewash the fact, or either way, that like most of the rich people in this world are white, but not all. And like, that if you tell every story about, a poor brown kid, is that they're from the ghetto or the barrio or anything like that, like, that's just as problematic. So yeah, I just thought that was just a nicely nuanced way to take on that character. Well, I think
excuse me.
I think it's probably a good time to wrap up. We'll have some bonus content. We're going to talk a little bit about some Riki's favorite storylines from the original X-Men and how we might see them in future things. For everybody else, though, of course, please think about becoming a member. $5 a month, $55 a year. Please sign up for not sign up, but follow us on social media. Send us feedback. Send us your thoughts. All those good things. On behalf of Riki and myself, we have spoken. Superhero Ethics is an Ethical Panda podcast, part of the True Story FM network. If you enjoyed the show, please share it and leave a rating or review in your podcast app if possible. The best way to support us is by becoming a member. Find info and social links in the show notes. Thanks for listening.
To me, my X-Men.